Hello everyone, today we continue our series about Indo-European theology through linguistics and phonetics, at least as far as the root sounds associated with particular metaphysical concepts are concerned. Today we talk about a very important sound, that is the one of the. As in the Proto-Indo-European theology, this phoneme corresponds to the light, which, as you understand, has a very transcendent meaning. As we've seen, actually, all these sounds are connected with the same broader concept, just different facets of the same. But some of the most important words in the Indo-European vocabulary, including the one of God, come from this phoneme, right? The phoneme D denotes, in fact, exclusively the created, manifested luminosity, the radiant principle that has already emerged from the primordial tenebrous waters that we made really so many videos to understand better the role of recently on tenebrous waters of creation, and has at lux fuit, right, and has separated from the unmanifest absolute creative unity symbolized by Eka, that is the one dwelling in those waters, before the act of differentiation. This light in and of itself is never the originative pre-differentiated principle, a role reserved solely for the Ka. We'll get all these references better, but we're speaking a bit too sort of orientally here, but as we've seen, these concepts were shared universally, and they were quite important Indo-European infusions, but not only, because if you go back to the legions of the Hyperboreans, you understand, for example, in Egyptian tradition, that the Western origin of the sacred race is something quite explicit, and we will make lots of videos about that, for that matter. In any case, this light in particular, functionally, is the one that has become phenomenal, temporal, directional, active, visible, consumptive, nourishing, ordering, and ritually central as always as well. Right? It is the light that now moves continuously in steady self-radiation, flows visibly toward perception, burns with consuming and devouring intensity, rises vertically to the zone of greatest celestial concentration, curves along the horizon in its cyclic ascent and descent as vapor and rain as well, illuminates outward forms and renders them apprehensible, inflicts the searing pain of heat that reduces to ash, prompts the inaugural meal at the precise moment of dawn visibility, produces the bright sky and day and the divine powers through the act of separation, kindles the sacred fire on the ground to consecrate domestic and communal space, upholds cosmic and moral regularity, streams as devotional and contemplative thought in the mind, erupts in sudden violent flashes of lightning of racing forest conflagrations with explosive bursting of resinous timber, confers the curved life-giving motion that becomes dexterity, and the right side fixes bounded enclosures for house and domestic animals, and distributes life through giving, offering, portioning, dividing, cutting, harvesting, and even binding together at the same time. There are naturally many concepts that we've already seen in this series, and not only. Some are also intuitively self-explanatory, just like the golden age dripping honey from the oak tree is considered, of course, in metaphysical terms, as coming from this light. That is a medium in space. As you've seen here, it's even connected with vapor and rain, because this is exactly what the power of sort of the thunder of lightning has in creating life in the darkness of the abyss in a deeper metaphysical sense. And so it cannot be separated from all the from all creation, and as a bridge as well. It can be the symbol, the same grace of the same Holy Ghost descending. Think about the Annunciations and the angelic figures that carry that light. So the entire traditional knowledge is permeated with this concept, right? Think about in Gothic architecture how the walls had to literally represent light, and that's why they're so shiny, luminous, smooth, right? Well illuminated, because in theory, this great construction essentially represented heavenly perfection, therefore absolute light, while not being properly of this world, right? It was not much a matter of not being physical as we intended, or material more precisely. It is about this lower nature transfiguring into a higher one, right? Now, deeply transcendental fashion. We will understand now linguistically what connections exist with the phoneme D. And some of them are very famous. As we were saying before, the concept of Deus Pater, and as we'll see now, all the various also regional etymologies connected with that and widespread all over Indo-European language actually occur. We'll explain this now step by step, and this manifested luminosity definitely aligns precisely with the core of Proto-Indo-European root they, right? From the Proto-Indo-European they, to shine, to be bright, whose extended term deu from the Proto-Indo-European dia, daylight, bright sky, underlies the personified daylight sky as the seat of the gods across branches, interestingly enough. Remember always the tree of the world, the oak, sacred oak, and you find, I said today we will obviously look a lot at Sanskrit, Hellenic, Latin, because these are the cornerstone of especially Proto-Indo-Europeistic. Some of you told me they don't use the term Proto, or don't use the term Indo for that. That's another story. But here we have to do so, if anything, because, well, okay, we could say European. I also made a video about the Europeans of Asia, for that matter. But it's important also to stress how far and wide, beyond conventional continental separations, this went, as much as realizing that there was probably a Proto-Indo-European in the moment in which the Indo-European branches were not fundamentally fully separated, right? And I'm going to make a video if you're interested in how or why, at least didactically speaking, this was employed as a model, as a descriptive model, right? Some of it obviously is arbitrary, but I think conventionally you can use the term. You could use also many other terms for that matter in a more original form. The important is that we understand each other, which is definitely what we're here condensing all this amount of linguistic evidence to in the first place. So adding a bit also from the other branches, as we'll stick mostly again to the magic tree, so to say, and as others are also later documented in different, less documented sometimes in different ways, we can notice obviously the same identical root for this divine meaning in the Celtic devil, that is properly the shining one, given the old Irish dia, God, the Gaulish devos, and the Germanic reflex thivas from dephos, right? And this is completely normal. We've seen it in other videos. There are originally also composite. This is not quite the case, but sometimes you even lose the originary phoneme in the ways that at least it is spoken, but etymologically it was connected with that. And these are all very sort of similar, as you know. And naming the archaic sky god of the assembly and heroic oath preserved in the Old Norse Tyr, while the Slavic div, that is wonder, marvel, divine apparition, and Baltic devats, continued the luminous celestial potency in the same semantic field. Now, the most immediate verbal expression of this manifested light is the root Sanskrit di, right, with the long I, from the same Proto-Indo-European day, that is to shine, which captures the continuous, uninterrupted shining, the steady, self-sustaining blaze that constitutes the essential activity of daylight across the entire diurnal span without beginning or end within that cycle. Right? Sanskrit preserves this root with exceptional transparency. For example, in the verb the dati, that is from the Proto-Indo-European day, to shine, blaze, to radiate, while the same luminous persistence underlies the cognate notions of rendering manifest, making evident, bringing into clarity, right, and causing to appear in the daughter languages. This is very interesting because as we've seen for the darkness that we already inquired, especially with the root na, the concept of sort of vision is metaphysically tied to sin. So if you can't see, it's because of your own fault. It's because of your own shutting to light itself. There are many parallelisms to this. Think about the same idea of gold as the highest element, the one with which the same citadel of the gods is built, it is shining and everything. So we'll get gradually to all of this also in our mythological videos. However, it's as readily evident how this dichotomy proceeds. The root Sanskrit didi, that is shining thought, essentially, from data, closely connected, reinforces this with the sense of shining in thought or mediation, linking the continuous radiation of light to the inner illumination of the mind as well. Everything starts from the mind, the vision, the eye of Ra, so to say. That is the providential capacity of foreseeing the future, but as an active molder of that, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make much sense. The idea of the seer that simply sits there and doesn't actually carry out the thing itself is not really, it's already a product of decadence in these theological concepts. Now, directly allied to this continuous shining is the perceptual process embodied in the root Sanskrit drish, from Proto-Indo-European derk, to see, to perceive, to look upon. Here the segment rish functions as a transparent phonetic, because you understand it's just the D in the front, right? So it's the suffix, transparent phonetic and semantic variant of the archaic Indo-European rish, to flow, to stream, to rush, in fact, onward. And that's how close actually it arrived in our languages. The act of seeing is therefore understood as the very flowing of manifested light itself. When you look at the symbolism of the hero, the conquering hero, whose chariot goes ahead into the world, it's always advancing together with the sun, right, in the celestial vault. And this expresses the concept of advance, of conquest, and of molding of the world, of purification of the world as well, consecration of the conquest, right, from a lower condition. The arrival of created luminosity at the point of human consciousness, the streaming of visible light into the domain of sight, so that vision becomes the primary mode through which this light discloses the world, with derivatives such as Sanskrit drishta, that means seen, noticed, also drishti, sight, point of view, darsana, vision, intellectual vision, philosophical system, even, interestingly, that's basically ideology to a degree, and darshin, the one who sees, the teacher specifically. Interestingly, this perceptual streaming of light corresponds to the Proto-Indo-European root derk, to see, to glance, to gaze sharply, yielding, among others, the Hellenic derkomai, that is to see clearly, the aorist stem drak that names the sharp-sighted Hellenic drakon, that is dragon, the one who stares with deadly gaze, and that the slaying of naturally makes you acquire the wisdom, and so the vision, because as you know, wisdom and vision have respectively from Germanic and Latin the same Indo-European etymology. Also, the Germanic, in fact, sekvana, to see, whose zero grade sieve continues the visual flow of manifested light into Old English seon, Old Norse sja, and Gothic saivan, right? And there are naturally different words in the same sort of various Indo-European languages, vocabularies that, other than being just entwined, as we've just seen, are derived from the original concept. They're different from other words derived from the same concept, as we just pointed out with wisdom, for example. Now, and you understand, the more back you go into the sort of the primal meaning, and sort of the more you realize how there's not even technically a divide between them semantically. Now, the constitutive separation that marks the entry of light into the created order finds its clearest lexical encoding in the root Sanskrit div, as we've seen from, again, the Diev, sky, day, shine, where V contributes the primordial sense of distancing. That's how it works, mechanically proceeding away from a source while still deriving existence from it, which is the doctrine of the two natures, as a matter of fact. We're essentially just an hologram of a higher light. Like, this is world of darkness. In the divine nature, you have the sublimation of the soul. Hence, also, for example, the miracle of transfiguration has to do with light. If you read the same Bible, that's how it happens. Now, the sky in Sanskrit, div, diu, but also diva, divya, celestial, divine. This is obviously connected, say, diva, for example, the same Latin, the divine female, right? Is therefore that which has separated itself from light, yet remains saturated by it. And this refers, obviously, the hypostasis between the two natures. They is the temporal portion of reality flooded by this departed radiance, hence the D of day for that matter. The celestial divine powers, the Deva, the potency divine God in Sanskrit, in the same language, Devi, the goddess, Daiva, belonging to the god's destiny and fate as well. So remember this idea of vision, which is not fate or destiny, unless you're subordinated to it as a lower being, but it has to do with a complete control, right, of the course of the world, and therefore is not something fatalistic as we would philosophically intend today in a deeply post-traditional reality. Well, all these are the beings that inhabit precisely this domain of separated, bright heaven, right? The Vedic div, diu, deva traces to dev, devos, meaning celestial shining God, with the related derivative devos yielding the general term for God in many branches, while the Avestan cognate daiva from the same concept of shining being, later rejected as chaotic false god in the Zoroastrian reform that had the sort of some messy things going on with our religious movement in ancient Persia, but we'll see this better in another video. Well, this preserves the same root, but inverted in moral balance because of this Iranian issue. And it has to do, of course, with Manichaeism as well, with a certain perceivable dualism into which, in particular, Avestan tradition sort of descended into sort of later antiquity. You have, as we were saying before, like the Celtic devil, for example, that gives the Irish dia, the Welsh duv, and the same luminous celestial entity. The highest expression of this celestial paternity is the ancient compound Dios Pitru in Sanskrit, the sky father, which continues in Vedic Dios Pitru, in Hellenic Zeus, Deus, essentially coming from, in Latin, Jupiter, Dio Pater. That's where it literally comes from. Each preserving the original structure in which the supreme God is the personified luminous vault of the day itself. This compound, Deus Pater, daylight sky father, is the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European designation for the bright day sky as divine paternal entity, reflected also in, the Illyrian Dei Patrus, that was naturally also influenced by surrounding populations, but again, it was basically all the same. The Germanic Tivats we pointed out before, and with distant Slavic echoes in the archaic divine sky title preserved in the Old Church Slavonic, as we've seen before with the wondrous celestial being. When this solar light is regarded in its consuming destructive intensity, the capacity of the sun to ignite fire, to scorch matter, to reduce substance to ash through persistent heat, the roots Sanskrit do and do with the longer vowel emerge, right? This is very much connected with what we were saying before with the idea of nectar, of the soma. And so the idea that this divine power fortifies those who can handle it, but destroys instead those who can't, right? There is a deep divide, again, between the two natures. Only who is able to elevate oneself to the higher can fully handle this power. Also, as intervening in the world, only the relentless radiance of the sun could have given birth to the notion of burning and associated it so intimately with suffering as a consuming, devouring force, both physical and moral. The Sanskrit do to burn and do to be consumed by heat or pain. Dunati, the same language, to burn, to torment. Dukkha, pain, affliction, misery. Duna, burnt, afflicted. Dava, wood placed on fire, right? So you see the sacrificial victim or element in any case, in also the self-sacrificial attainment, as we will see now. As you, little spoiler, the devotio in Latin comes exactly from the same idea of self-sacrifice, that with good peace of those who say, oh no, but you can't make the parallelism between Woden and Christ. It's not a thing. It's the same identical literal thing. The entire Indo-European meaning is fundamentally self-sacrifice. Otherwise, you cannot attain the higher divine power. And this is present all across the entire universal tradition. Whoever denies this is just a lesser human being. All right. You have the Sanskrit Dava forest fire conflagration as well, that sort of the thunder striking the sacred tree that burns with this sacrificial meaning. We've seen it recently in other videos discussing especially later alchemic wisdom. And so the idea that this burning is actually not eliminating energy but procuring new one through the divine medium. So a very important inversion of the sort of quite materialistically oriented, at least general approach that we have to physics in general. And I will have to make lots of videos, if anything, just to explain that alone, because it's big. But tradition answers this in its own way. Sanskrit yields also Dava, that is the great burning. They all trace back to the solar source, as do, for example, the Hellenic Dia, pain, woe, ruin. The Hellenic Dios, burning, destructive. Deus, hostile, destructive by fire. And the Latin dolor, right? Pain, from dolos, it's also a broader concept of damage, forming an unbroken experiential chain that links solar heat to the sensation of being eaten alive by fire. And obviously referring to the sacred fire, so you have Vesta, for example, whether, in this sense, external flame or internal torment, right? So it's normal that also because of the same doctrine of two natures, there is a higher metaphysical and only apparently metaphorical meaning, and then a more apparently just sort of merely material one that is never the case. Like there is no such separation in tradition. And I will not make any comments on the Cathars because, I already received some interesting comment about that. It was actually a funny one, how to treat dualism, which is exactly burning at the stake. And because at that point, you see, it's not about mortifying the flesh for a purpose that is higher. It's mortifying the flesh just for the sake of it. And that's a big difference between dualism and actual Catholicism that Indo-European religion as a whole fundamentally was. Now, there are, as you understand here, it's useless to digress and make other examples, say, okay, that's so similar to other concepts that are tied perfectly into the whole picture. Yes, because that's exactly how this cosmology was intended. Now, the vertical axis of this light, right, its gathering and concentration in the highest celestial regions where it is most intense, generates the fundamental adverb in Sanskrit ud. that means up, above, on, high. From this elevated position flows a dense and interconnected cluster of concepts. Water is conceived as the substance that arises in vapor, as it is properly warmed by divine heat. And so the daylight itself, that traces the curved line of the horizon, in the sense, again, by the way, and hence also the Deus Pater Jupiter Pluvius and the connection of the Godfather of thunder with in this sense of the light, but also with the control of water of the rain, because he's omnipowerful. That's the beautiful concept behind that dichotomy, Uranian chthonic. You have the Sanskrit udaka, which means water. In fact, there are naturally, again, different waters and from different etymologies, as we were saying before. The na is sort of connected with that as well, but ud in particular, plus ak, a, circular motion in high, as we've seen in the video about the K sound, that is actually the single most important, even more important than the D in Indo-European phonology. You have you have udaka, then you have the udan, that is wave in water. You have udra, proceeding from high, this is all in Sanskrit. Then in Hellenic, equally, you have udor, right? We were talking about it just the other day in the video about alchemy, and so the sacred water from which everything is born, because as we've seen with the root word gna, of agnis, ignis, that is the fire, that represents in the European language the sort of zigzag motion. This is exactly indicating when the thunder strikes in the darkness of the abyss, as basically gravitating the Mother Earth in the darkest abyss of the womb, and where God, the saved from waters from darkness, is born. Right, the same goes for Christianity in the darkness, in the manger, in the lowest possible location, and then you have in Hellenic, it's the same composite, udra, right? You have the Latin aqua, which actually derives etymologically, even though the first part is lost, from ud, ak, and a, right? And so the D is not present here, but the same Latin for water comes from the association of these two mechanisms, because in this sense, this is sacred water, the one that is struck by thunder, right? And in fact, you have initially like K proper, eventually Latins started writing it with QU, just as is still, for example, in Italian. Now, the upward impulse of the voice in ritual proclamation, solemn chant, or ordinary utterance produces the udir, that in Sanskrit is to raise the voice, to speak, to proclaim, right? Which extends into udiati, that is to rise, udiao, to proclaim, the Hellenic aido, that is to sing, the Hellenic still aoide, song, aido, aoidos, singer, bard, the Hellenic aude, human voice, tone, audao, to speak, idem the Latin audio, right, to hear, because this is essentially a connection with a higher light, right, receiving at the same time the capacity of singing in the harmony with God. Always remember what we were saying before regarding Gothic cathedrals, that they weren't built because of Vitruvius's De Architectura. They were built on Augustine's De Musica, as a matter of fact, right, from a deeply Neoplatonic background. And so the idea is that singing, just like it happened in the rite, in the liturgy, had to conform the speaker to the singer to the higher architecture, so resonating with that, but also as such itself, because that was the moment in which you align yourself with divine harmony, cosmos, imitating essentially the same perfection of the celestial world's music in movement. Hierarchical and qualitative superiority appears in the Sanskrit uttara, that is higher, superior. You understand immediately the connection with utter. You have uttama, that is the highest, the absolute superlative. Then you have udara, noble, illustrious. Moving high, that's the actual semantic etymology. The concept of something elevating itself and therefore becoming brighter, right? Anatomical elevation is reflected in the Sanskrit udara, that is also belly, viewed as the rising part. Udar, for example, this is the female breast as the high nourishing member. Equally, you have the Hellenic ustera, that is uterus, that is the actual Latin uterus, and the sense of overflowing abundance and fertility in the Latin uber, which stands for memory, fertile, rich, interestingly enough. The Latin ubertas as well, fertility, abundance, hence something that flourishes, that, as we've seen before, like the nectar of the divine oak tree flows, emerges as probably a divine soma from the transfigured nature. The precise instant of daily reemergence after darkness constitutes the foundational threshold of human and ritual existence. The root Sanskrit ad, for example, from Proto-Indo-European head, that is at the beginning to heat, therefore signifies something like at the beginning, at the initial point of light, right? The initial point, the commencement, plus D. And from this luminous dawn, moment radiates the entire semantic field of consumption and nourishment, right? Because at that point you derive nourishment, as we just observed, as long as this power exists. The principal meal taken when the word once more becomes visible becomes the archetypal act of eating. In fact, ad in Sanskrit stands to eat. Adana is the act of eating food. Adya, just like in Latin, the root of edible. Atman means meal. Anna is food that is eaten. Anna is full of food. Equally, you have in Hellenic edodimos, edible. Edodef, food, nourishment. You have the Latin edo, to eat. Edax, that is voracious. Edulus, edible. The tooth is the eating, the truly the one that carries out the mechanism, the instrument of consumption. Because just as we've seen in the root, for example, K, there is an idea that this light also parcels out things and orders them in a new form, right? And you have the Sanskrit danta, for example. You understand how close it is to the Latin dens, right? In fact, in Latin, you can just add e to dens and you have edens, so the guy who's eating, really the same etymology. The Sanskrit dan is the participle forms of ad. And equally you have the Hellenic odon with prosthetic vowel. The violent action of biting is encoded in Sanskrit damsh, danpushuk, that is the contact with teeth. Dazati, to bite. Think about sacred fury as dazacht. In Old Irish, it's essentially the Celtic version of the furor, right? And and you have the axe bitten, and the guy is still in some iconography in the High Middle Ages of the berserker fundamentally biting, as it's in line with the Norse sagas, the shield at some point. We'll come back to that because it's very, very interesting, and it has all to do with those. It's a sacred madness, essentially, because that's also what das Act became, to be understood later, a bit like the furor, right? But the initial meaning was nothing less but virtus. In fact, there are a bunch of imbeciles out there in this neo-pagan kind of Reddit forums that since they're not intelligent enough to understand that even a video made long time ago was actually looking at the semantic meaning comparison, not in the same linguistic descendancy, they had to say something like there was actually equating the term virtus linguistically, so properly from the etymological root to these other terms, including other Latin terms, by the way, but including the Das Act, it's a sacred fury. And so, it's so disappointing to talk to people who are, by the way, I'm not talking to them, because in particular, I think that it takes a very rare form of cerebral impairment to believe in neo-paganism, whatever people think that actually is even supposed to mean. But if you don't even understand such basic lessons, I wonder how has it made at the time in particular, like how can you understand even this more complicated ones? But no matter what you're saying online, everything is going to be devoured in pretty animal-like fashion by people that don't know even to digest the full pieces. In fact, they should listen to the etymology of biting in the Indo-European sacred practice here. You have the Sanskrit dum shtur. By the way, we could also do without this precise pronunciations, but because it's the meaning that counts. In this case, it means biter, but we're trying to make something pseudo-decent about Indo-Europeistics here. You have this damshaka, that is tooth, the damshin, that is dog, right? It's because it bites. Equally, you have the Hellenic dakno, to bite, dakos, dangerous biting animal, for example. The pleasurable dimension of agreeable. Sweet food appears in Sanskrit svad, from su, that is good, well, plus ad, that is to make pleasant, to sweeten. Svadu, sweet, agreeable, and literally sweet comes from the same. You have Hellenic hedo, to please, to delight, with characteristic adaptations. The S should be basically like a rough breeding, U/V, that is disappearance. So the A, the A passed to the A, basically. And so how you have these interesting changes later, but we can't reconstruct these. And some of this is, let's say, relatively conjectural. At least we will never have the 100% proof, but we kind of understand that through the meaning itself, that would have been the root and the phonetic change over time. You have the Hellenic hedone, that means pleasure, joy, and hedonistic. The Hellenic hedus, that is sweet, pleasant. And this is very interesting because it all stems from the don't trigger consumption, from head to eat. With zero grade participle forms yield the dental instrument of eating, as we've seen, danta, odon, dens. The mobile, visible, and therefore apprehensible quality of this light in continuous displacement generates the root id in Sanskrit, where e is to go, motion, such as in Latin, for example, ire, plus d, that is the going, the motion of light in particular, right? Producing the broad domain of appearance, outward form, figure, idea, and intellectual grasping of what manifests itself. I can't stress enough how similar, in particular, all these languages, in particular Sanskrit to Latin, it really is, notoriously enough. But all Indo-European languages share the same roots. You have the Sanskrit hidata, to praise, to pray, to implore, right? And so the idea like in cartoons, that is actually derived from a traditional concept. The moment of prayer, the light descends on you, right? You've seen it, in The Sword in the Stone. Like, speaking of Disney movies, when still there were something. And that's basically the indication of grace and power that derives from this internal predisposition that between action and contemplation rewards you, crowns you with a shiny, by the way, crown. That is the laurel and the aura that, as we were saying before, also we see in the saints, in the holy, in the miracle transfiguration. The act of imploring is to address essentially the visible and precious. It's understanding essentially what you're turning to, that is God. And so if you nail that direction, if you do it the right way, you will receive this light back. You have the Sanskrit idea that is worth to praise, glorious. Idana, act of praising. Here, one who praises. The same Hellenic idea, so idea, means, it derives from the root of the divine. It means aspect, form, appearance. Right? This is very important because also in philosophy, I recently made a video a bit about at least Aristotle and Plato. The concept of a ghost that informs the substance, right, spiritually speaking, is exactly what the concept of idea really is, right? In this sense, the Greeks were the best at linguistically outlining the correct philosophical concept, right? And it is probably something visible. If you think about Plato's Hyperuranion, you realize that the highest idea is there, and it is as such luminous because it belongs to the divine standard. This is basic doctrine of the two natures, being and becoming. You have the Hellenic eidos, shape, figure, the Hellenic eidolon, image, phantom, apparition, right? The Hellenic eidos, we've seen to be visible, to appear, to see, to know. Equally, the Latin video. You have vi plus id, that is to see. Hence, for example, just like in Greek, the Latin idolum, this image, right? And so something that in a more participative, sort of spiritually participated time would have properly contained the spiritual power, as opposed to a degenerating superstitious idolatry, typical of the chthonic world and the pagans, probably the lower strata. The introduction of aspiration transforms the into the, vastly expanding the semantic field toward the active caring, deliberate placing, ritual kindling, and resolute upholding of light, particularly in its consecrated form as sacrificial fire. And hence you have the root Sanskrit da, from de, to place, denoting the intentional deposition of light upon earth. It's never random, right? You must attain something in order to get that. The kindling of the perpetual heart flame that sacralizes domestic space, so the sacred rite that brings that form, that idea, as we've seen, so the spirit to order the lower nature, founding the order of the family, instituting the divine and communal law. You have the Sanskrit dati, that is to place, to establish, to institute. Daman, that is position of the sacred fire, bold, low, an order. Datir, the founder, the establisher, the ordainer. And as we will see here, the concept of do in Latin and even to do in English derive from this, because it's a totalizing experience, right? So whatever action is meant in the European language to attain this order, right? And so in Sanskrit, again, it's basically like the languages that we speak in the West as well. You have daka, that is the receptacle, storeroom. You have in Hellenic tithemi, to place, to set. Themis, which is the divine law, but also in the sense custom ordinance. It is something that was established, right? Not something that had no, so it's simply to abstractly imitate. It has an actual manifestation, even though it's in Hellenic in particular much more tendentially abstractly conceptualized. Thesis, for example, from thesis, right? In Greek, is literally the act of placing. You're actually bringing this to the table when you're literally writing your thesis. That's basically what it is. We're trying to demonstrate something. Equally, the Latin facio, it is to make, to do, to form, condo, to put together, to found, perfectus, that is completed, perfected. This intentional placing of the sacred light fire from there to do, put, place, set, reflecting itself majorly in the language with, for example, the Hellenic titemi, dadati, facio, also the Germanic dona, to do, literally, giving the Old English don, the Old Norse gera, the Gothic gadaujan, the firm unyielding bearing of this light produces the Sanskrit dri, there, to hold, to uphold, to sustain firmly. So to elevate, in other words, in a metaphysical sense, through form and spirit. Dharma, the same dharma, the cosmic and moral order, law, duty, righteousness, prescribed conduct. Right? This tells you how physically informing this concept is from a divine spirit. Dharma, to establish order, driti, that is steadfastness, resolution, dhruva, permanent, enduring. Then you have the Hellenic thronos, that is the seat of power, the throne. All right, treskeia, religious observance, piety, treskeio, to observe rites, to worship. All right. Equally, these terms yield the Latin firmus, firm, steadfast, the Germanic teriana, to support, to sustain, yielding the Old English derian, that is, to hold fast. The continuous streaming displacement of light in contemplative and devotional directions also appears in the Sanskrit the H long I, from the Proto-Indo-European they, that is thought and vision, continuous movement of light in the mind, as we were hinting at before. Religious thought, devotion, meditative reflection, faith, inward illumination. Sanskrit the, so religious thought, devotion yields didi, that is to meditate, to shine in thought. Vita, which stands for mediated, reflected. Always remember the role of the sacred ruler as a divine medium, for that matter. So the fact that this being is essentially a divinity manifesting in human form, as a numen, so being able to handle this light, just like Jupiter handles his lightning, right? Force, and that is exactly sort of reflecting in some qualities in this person. Hence also the miracle of transfiguration. Hence also the decursio, the cremation practice with fire that sort of brings this light that burns out of this fire and demand that fuels it, right, in divine terms, from himself returning to heaven. You have the Sanskrit dhyana, that is the profound abstract meditation, which is, interestingly enough, the direct source of Chinese Chan and Japanese Zen, because, as you know, the founder of Zen Buddhism was a Greek from Bactria, right? And there, all the melange of Western, Eastern branch of Indo-European languages passed further east, right? Also for those who think that basically Indo-Europeans and other peoples are separated, there was no commixtion whatsoever. I want to make actually more videos about the topic because, surprise, surprise, when liberals would like the world to be all mixed and nothing to be of particular culture, all of a sudden everybody was not European fundamentally instead has a courageously absolute sort of its own local native thing, and Europeans have nothing to do with that. You can't do that with Eurasia. Sorry to disrupt your fantasies. Now, the related Sanskrit adi, that is to direct the mind toward, to apply oneself to, becomes the verb for to read itself. Obviously, the sacred texts, and this happens in later Sanskrit, admittedly, with the arrival of writing, but that's also how we know the Vedic tradition and otherwise left very scarce archaeological finds for that matter. And so obviously the sacred texts help you to align your mind toward God. The ritual summoning, agitation, and upward offering of light through altar kindling, for example, fragrant smoke production, incense fumigation, and ecstatic turbulence, belong to the Sanskrit du, the H long U, that is to shake, kindle, smoke. To kindle fire, to produce smoke, to sacrifice, to perfume, to agitate in divine possession, which is not different from the incense in the frankincense in Christian tradition as well. You have the Sanskrit do together with do noti, to kindle, duma, that is smoke and vapor. Remember, this emanates essentially from the combustion of an ipso facto purified substance that becomes suddenly of a higher nature. Still in Sanskrit, you have dupa, that is incense, perfume, dupana, fumigation, dumaya, eclipse, because it was thought to be smoke covered, so to say. And you have there some force that here would be very interesting to explain it in both a metaphysical and astronomical sense, but you understand that, again, what we said before about the chthonic element, the moon in that sense not transfigured by solar light yet, that sort of covers the sun because of it was understood as a terrible, ominous event in antiquity, right? Foreshadowing disgrace, tragedy, disasters, etc. Like it had to do with this. You have in Greek theo, that is to burn offerings, to sacrifice, to fume. Themos, vital breath, soul, heart, anger. Thusia, sacrifice, sacred rite. Thumiao, to burn incense. It sounds like a cat tone, the way I said. Latin fumo, to smoke, flow, to blow, that stands there to revive the flame, so to insufflate, to inject further into the burning fire. In fact, the same suffio means to perfume, to fumigate at the same time, which is in this sense also mixed with flating, sufflating. The abrupt, violent eruption of this light, the lightning bolt, wildfire racing through resinous forests, the explosive report of bursting timber receives a lexical form in the Sanskrit dra, dru, dri. That is to say, these are all various, again, you can find them as suffixes or prefixes in different words. It stands for swift running, to precipitate flight before danger, violent splitting apart, tearing open, flaying, shattering. Because this is essentially the thunderbolt that smashes a tree that keeps standing but burns, and in this sense it's sacrally transcending and emanating further energy. It's also the necessity of keeping constantly alive the sacred fire. In Sanskrit, you have dra together with drati, that is to run, to hasten. Dravati, to flow swiftly. Dirnati, to burst, to split, to penetrate. Daru, wood, tree that burns. You have daru, timber. You have the Hellenic dero, to flay, to skin. the Hellenic drepanon, the sickle, a Latin dolo, to hew, to cut to pieces. As we were saying before, it's connected also with that damage in terms, however, of sort of ordering. This is to be found in many foundational myths. For example, especially the Chthonic deity that is cut to pieces and scattered all around. That's the principle of the same seeding, of same agriculture for that matter, that requires the higher godfather, the sun, the rain. You have the Germanic treva, that is tree, timber, maintaining the connection with sort of the tree, the sacred tree, extending to having connection with that. And the Slavic dervod is wood, tree, and all because these have to burn as the consecrated wood for the sacred fire. Both continuing the same root connection, as you understand here, phonetically, between violent light and combustible forest substance. The curved, vital, life-conferring motion of solar energy underlies the Sanskrit daksh, that is dex, Proto-Indo-European dex, that is right or south, and it's a composite of D plus ak and sh, and it basically means to bound the curved motion of light. This has to do with something we've seen also in the Vedas, meaning of the cardinal points. There is all sort of geological, astronomical connection of the actual physical location of certain spirits across the world. We can't digress now on that, but the idea that those that have to be conquered lay south from the north is there. Hence, ability, dexterity, but also right side and south. As you're marching towards the sun yourself, right? And you have the Sanskrit daksh, the rising sun, Sanskrit daksh that also yields dakshata, to be able to be capable. Daksha, that is expert, skillful. Dakshinya, that is right south, sacrificial offering. You have the Hellenic dexios, that is right. The Hellenic dexia, right hand. Hellenic dexiotes, dexterity, and equally in Latin dexter, that is right. Latin dexteritas, dexterity, skill. They're the same concept, and this stems from handling the light with your right. The fixing of limits in illuminated space produces the Sanskrit dam, that is da plus am, as a Proto-Indo-European root, them, to build, to tame, to give limit. And in this sense, it corresponds to house, enclosure, domestication. In Sanskrit, dam is house. Dampati, lord of the house. Dhamma, dhamyati, to tame, to subdue. Dhamya, domestic, tameable. In Hellenic, domos, house. Doma, dwelling. Latin, domus, house, which is very beautiful, given that, for example, the same concept of pomerium is the domus of the imperium. And therefore, it is a sacred perimeter where everything is wielded in power. The Latin verb domo is to tame. And so there is properly a superior mission and capacity in taming, in subduing, and in holding. The difference between regere and imperare simply is that you have to elevate the sort of what you have conquered to a higher level. Otherwise, you would have failed, right? You would have simply destroyed and not created. And so also, Latin is the dominus master of the house. That has to do the same with his family. The pater familias has the right of life and death over the entire family. You have the Germanic tamyania, to tame, giving the Old English temian. In the Slavic, house with domiti, to tame. The life-sustaining distributing generosity of daylight governs the Sanskrit da, Proto-Indo-European de with this root d plus a, that is means to give proper. And so the effect of the action of light that gives, to give, to offer, to divide, to cut, to bind, right? Hence also the sacred offering. In Sanskrit, you have the composite da, dati, to give, dana, gift, act of giving, datar, the giver, datar, the sickle, because it is the one that properly cuts what has to be offered, daya, that is portion, inheritance, daman, cord, river as well. In Hellenic, you have didomi, to give, doron, that is gift, do in Latin, that is properly to give, right? And it's very beautiful because it's also the matrix of donum, gift, votive offering. The Germanic dona has the same, to give. Gothic donian, Slavic dati, it's all about giving. And so therefore to a higher nature that makes this offering light. And so you understand how vast, rigorously coherent this lexical and conceptual edifice is, with every single derivation, every cross-linguistic correspondence, every semantic extension returning without exception to the single theological intuition of the created manifested light, the light that has separated from primordial darkness and unity that now shines continuously, flows to the eye, separates into the sky and gods, burns and torments, arises intensely, prompts the dawn meal, appears and is known, is placed and upheld in ritual fire, streams as religious thought, is offered upward in smoke and ecstasy, erupts violently, confers dexterous motion, founds bounded domestic space, and distributes life through giving and portioning. Right? The idea of the sacrifice is beautiful in particular, because if you think about the conceptual sort of the idea of hell that is often said, there is no such thing like hell really. Well, there is, aside from the fact that there are some, well, let's not open this parenthesis now, because talking about the underworld and the hellish chthonic dimension, thinking about volcano, we made recently a video about, for example, the sacred nature of metallurgy in the ancient Eurasian tradition. And so the netherworld is populated, but it's also a lower point where to be that you have to go through, however, in order to achieve the higher level. And so when you look at the great Romanesque frescoes in the high medieval churches with all the damned burning in hell, that is actually very accurate, as far as hell is exactly the other side of the coin of those who actually elevate themselves through fire. Right? These are the people who are burned forever by this, and in that sense are bound to disappear into nothingness. Right? And this is actually a very accurate idea of punishment, the idea of eternity that literally makes you null eternally without any escape is obviously one of us of further disappearance. Whereas fire is present also in later tradition. When you look at the purgatory, heaven is always present as light, at least it manifests in different ways. It's always divine grace and imperium, etc. But it has all a different role and capacity, right? Or at least the people who are able to handle that have, right? And so in this, the light constitutes the active, structuring, painful, nourishing, knowable, sacred, ordering principle of the entire phenomenal human, divine, and moral world for the Indo-European peoples. The Enlightenment, light as essentially a guide towards divinity, right? A necessary orientation towards the same sources of power, and light itself is what makes light visible, what makes you alive in it, right? And these concepts are definitely what we could even really easily talk with more and more linguistic examples, with more vocabulary from all Indo-European languages. We are again, accumulating at this point quite substantial amount of videos in the European theology. The broader here, let me check how many videos we made about this. Probably, like, we're several, I don't know whether... Yeah, this is the 7th. No, actually the 8th. So yeah, gradually we're getting there, and we are essentially constituting this in ever more practical ways. Some videos are longer, some are sort of more concise. But in any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.